Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to all participants.
Good morning.
Just before we start with ETF, just super quickly information about Zoom and some best practice. So the meeting will be recorded for its entirely. So please, if you didn't allow the recording of your face, just close your camera and that will be fine. Please do not unmute yourself, otherwise you are speaking or you want to speak, and just raise your hand if you want to during the discussion, if there will be any. And for the rest, there will be interpretation for all the meetings. So if you want to join the interpretation, you will find a little word on your on the bottom of the screen, and just as you can see on the screen, just choose the language you want to hear and join the interpretation service. So I think that it's all, and have a nice meeting. For any problem, we from Opinno are here for you, so just write in the chat or write directly to Opinno Italy, the main account, which is the host of the session. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So good morning, colleagues. We're going to start in a few minutes. We're just going to start exactly in time, so that because we have a busy schedule ahead of us, I'm just going to wait for a few more minutes. If you could write in the chat where you're from, it would be very nice, so we can see where everybody is from. I'm now in Greece, for instance, although I work in Italy. So let us see where everybody is from.
Good morning. My name is Imad Al Sakour. I am from Jordan, from Vocational Training Corporation, VTC.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. I am Nida Kishvili. I am from Georgia, from National Center of Quality Assurance.
Good morning. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hello, it's Marek Antodyta from BCC Foundation in Lublin, Poland.
Hello. Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry.
So welcome everybody to our webinar. This webinar is about trends in validation of non-formal and informal learning in the EU, but also, of course, in the neighborhood countries where we're going to focus on more today. My name is Arjen Day, and I am your host today. And in the past years, we've been reporting especially about validation of non-formal and informal learning in the context of the EQF, so in the countries in the Western Balkans and Turkey. But actually, we can see that the validation is developing in most of our partner countries now. They're all at different stages, and today we're going to discuss these developments that are taking place outside the EQF, as well as those that are taking place in Europe. So validation is very important for lifelong learning. It will allow us to recognize the learning that is taking place outside schools, outside the formal settings, and it's extremely important for adult learning and for upskilling and reskilling. So we're going to discuss these issues today. How are these systems developing? How are they being set up? And now let me give the floor immediately to my colleague, Manuela Prina, who will open this session. Thank you.
Thank
Manuela.
you. Thank you, Arjen. I hope you can hear me. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to the ETF webinar. I'm very glad to open today's workshop on this very important area of work, which really represents one of the pillars that we need to look at when we talk about the future of our education and training systems and the future of skills as well. I would like to welcome all representatives of all countries, organizations and institutions that are here today. We're here really from many countries. And I would like also to thank our colleagues from Ukraine for joining in and to share our deepest solidarity and support with you and on behalf of the ETF. Validation is definitely is something that is very important also in today's conditions we are living in. On one side, as regards the transformation of education and training system, where people are learning in many different ways, and this is not a novelty, this has always been, but we see that there is, of course, an acceleration of the diversity through which learning is generated. And this is why it's important that we give space and we construct systems that are able to recognize and validate the learning of individuals. So today's meeting, it's important to share the experience from many countries that ETF has been focusing on through a study last year. All countries see validations as an important pillar of qualification systems. It's something that it's really giving a lot of space and also a lot of ambitions in terms of how systems should make sure that validation is really an integral part of qualification systems and also of lifelong learning as such. But we see that there is, of course, still a lot to do, that regulations, institutions, systems are to be accompanied with many other actions, in particular in supporting individuals to learn on one side, but also to understand the value of validating what they've learned and making sure that this is somehow being formalized. This is also important to encourage people to engage in career pathways and to be confident about how different skills can lead them to different opportunities in the labor market. Today we will share also remarkable experiences from many different countries to be able to create a space for peer learning, which you know is at the heart of how ETF works. So ETF will continue to support the area of validation even more, because we know that there is going to be even more demand for working on the validation component of qualification systems in all countries through, of course, supporting peer learning, through giving advice, and through continuing to make sure that we study and we bring forward innovation in how things can be done in each different context. Today's meeting, we will focus on different things, and I go through those points because I know that the qualification team likes to be very precise. So we will look in how validation can work for individuals, how technology can be used to support its further development, how the right business model can be identified and funding mobilized, and how synergies with policies beyond education systems can be built. And with this, I close these opening remarks and wish everybody a good morning of exchange and of peer learning. Back to you, Arjen.
Thank you very much, Manu, and thank you for the introduction and for explaining all the issues that we're going to address today. Now I would like to give the floor to Koen Nanden. Koen is the person, he's responsible for the EQF advisory group and for the validation in non-formal and informal learning in the countries that are part of the EQF. And Koen is here today to pass some of the key messages on the latest development of validation from the Commission side. Koen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arjen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be here this morning with you for your important event. Like Manuela, I also want to express the European Commission solidarity with Ukraine. And welcome, of course, to Ukrainian participants to the event. Now, first, I would like to recall, and actually Manuela has also done it, that validation is and should be a key principle in any policy on skills or lifelong learning. What one learns should become visible in one way or the other, and also it should be put to use. I mean, this is crucial. So validation is also a mainstreamed principle in the EU skills agenda, even though there was no real concrete action on validation, specifically targeting validation in the latest version of the agenda. Now, the EU action still has a Council recommendation of 2012 as its base. So this Council recommendation was adopted in 2012 by the EU member states and addresses recommendations to the member states and also to the Commission. And it does a couple of things, actually. It invites, first of all EU member states to set up validation arrangements. Second, these arrangements should allow individuals to get their skills validated, including the possibility to obtain a qualification, a full or partial qualification on the basis of validated skills. Thirdly, and I think this is also an important landmark of this recommendation, it sets the 4 stages of validation, which it identifies, namely identification of skills, documentation of skills, thirdly, assessment, and finally, certification. However, important is that validation in this perception is not seen as having gone through all the 4 phases. Also, if you identify and document your skills, this can already be considered validation, and in many cases, also in labor market context, this will be very important. Fourth, it sets a number of principles. The link to national qualifications framework, important to have good access to validation, availability of guidance and counseling, very crucial, skills audits, linked to credit systems, quality assurance, and also professionalization of validation. Validation has to be done by professionals. And last but not least, if a qualification is obtained based on validated learning experiences, this qualification should comply with the same standards or equivalent standards as the standards applicable to qualifications obtained after formal learning. Now, with the last principle, we of course have an important bridge to the EQF recommendation, the recommendation on the European Qualifications Framework for Lifelong Learning. And when we look there at what validation, what is said about validation, I mean, we can see the following. First of all, there is the focus on learning outcomes, because a qualification is actually a formal outcome of an assessment by a competent authority that has determined that an individual has achieved learning outcomes to given standards. And then it says that, of course, those learning outcomes may be achieved through a variety of pathways, formal, non-formal, informal settings. So the key is really their learning outcomes. The way of how they were obtained is less relevant. Secondly, validation is really a clear objective of the EQF. Namely, the Council recommendation says that it aims at better linking formal, non-formal, and informal learning and supporting the validation of learning outcomes acquired in different settings. And finally, also is also crucial, validation is among the 10 referencing criteria. These criteria are used when EU countries and also the Western Balkan countries, for example, relate their national qualification framework or system and the levels to the levels of the EQF. They must address in this referencing report the topic of validation. Now, where do we currently stand? In the field of validation, I think my colleague Ernesto from Cedefop will tell you a bit more about this, but we're currently working on updating European guidelines for validating non-formal and informal learning. We're also preparing another version of the European inventory on validation. And for this, we will have a study that will start by the summer. And also here, I would like to express my gratitude for good cooperation, excellent cooperation that we have with the ETF, because the ETF has already covered partner countries, neighborhood countries in a previous version of the inventory, and they will do this. They will do this again. Then lastly, just a word about the skills agenda of 2020 of the Commission and the place that validation had there. As I said, no specific action on validation, but validation is a mainstreamed principle. And I want to refer to 3 different points. First of all, there was the evaluation that was carried out of the Council recommendation, and that validation pointed indeed to substantial progress. Validation is now, thanks to the recommendation, on the political agenda in all EU countries, but also in candidate countries, and I think also in most of the neighborhood countries. But also you have some persisting challenges, proposed responses. It's not yet fully mainstreamed, right? In all countries. There is still a lot of there is still a lot of work to do as well. And this we can say across the country. Some countries are a bit more advanced than others, but still we are not yet there. So it's still necessary to ensure the provision of support for individuals, closer coordination with guidance services, effective tailoring also of validation initiatives to disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. 2 initiatives of the skills agenda are very important in the field of validation. I would like to zoom in on those. First of all, the micro-credentials Council recommendation proposal proposed by the Commission in December 2021, currently under negotiation by the French presidency. This proposal is about a European approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. The proposal aims at setting standards and to create a common language on micro-credentials in Europe. And it refers to validation. Namely, it invites member states to support also the ongoing and emerging development of micro-credentials within the field of non-formal and informal learning. And secondly, it invites countries to adapt procedures for recognition of validation to allow also for the awarding of micro-credentials on the basis of validated skills and knowledge. Second, Council recommendation, I would say even more important in the fields of validation, is the one on individual learning accounts. So also a proposal by the Commission from December last year. This proposal is very much related to the target, the EU target of achieving 60% of adults being in learning by the year 2030. Validation plays a key role in this council recommendation. Amongst others, it is a key element of the enabling framework for achieving and implementing individual learning accounts. So I invite you, and I will put the proposals in the link of the webinar, and I invite you to consult them. Also, this one is currently under negotiation. Finally, to conclude, I would simply say that all learning should be made visible. I think this is a key principle in any lifelong learning, any skills policy. And in order to achieve this, validation should really be a mainstream element in policy. The reality, however, shows also within the EU that there is still a lot of work to do to get there, and to get validation also at the same level of acceptance as a way to obtain a qualification as formal learning in comparison to formal learning pathways. So this is the overall policy context that I wanted to sketch. And I wish you a very good event today. I think also one of the lessons learned from the validation recommendation is that it is good really also to have established institutionalized policies on validation to make validation work. Thank you. Back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Koen. Thank you very much. And I think you can see how dynamic actually this developments still are. There are many new developments. Of course, the upskilling and reskilling that is linked with the skills agenda, the attention to these micro-credentials, these smaller bits of learning that we need to recognize, not only the big qualifications. And also the idea of the funding of individuals and this attention to individuals. And that will also be central, I think, in the next presentation, which will be done by Ernesto Villalba from CEDEFOP. Ernesto, he's really Mr. Validation at the European level. He's following all these developments. He's coordinating the work on the guidelines from a technical point of view, and also the work on the inventory. I would like to give Ernesto now the floor to say something about the validation developments in the EU and the developmental trends. Ernesto, the floor is yours. I saw Ernesto a moment ago, so I presume he's still here.
Hello, yeah, can you hear me now? I think I was muted. Apologies for that. First, solidarity to the Ukraine's colleagues, and thank you for having me. Good morning. As Arjun said, I'm Ernesto Villalba from CEDEFOP, and what I will try to present now is a little bit the European approach, let's say, to kind of combine with what Koen has said about the European policies. I would try to kind of bring a little bit more deeper, let's say, what has happened in the last few years at the European level. Excuse me. So I hope you can see my presentation. Well, CEDEFOP has been working on validation for the last 20 years, so it has been really we have a lot of information about validation, and I have to say that I'm very glad to be here and to see that the ETF is getting more and more involved on validation and doing more work. We collaborate with ETF in a lot of aspects, and I think this is, of course, I'm very happy that we will be able to collaborate more on this area. So once again, I'm happy to be here, and I think that the work that you have done already with the studies that you have done and those fact sheets that you have sent us is already an interesting addition, and I think that it really shows a lot of the similar problems that we have in Europe in many ways. So excellent work and congratulations. Before I go into the specificities, let's say, I want to kind of highlight a little bit of the definition that we use at the European level. That, of course, Koen has referred to it a little bit. It comes from the 2012 recommendation, and Koen has also mentioned it. No, it's really, there are a lot of terms that are used on validation, as we know, many different countries that use different expressions, but really, as Kun said, this is really about making the invisible visible and to kind of giving some value to these knowledge and skills that somehow are invisible or they have not been, they cannot be seen, no? And the 2012 recommendation, I think, does a good job in putting together a concept and making sure that validation is seen as a process. And as Kun was saying, it's a little bit of an umbrella term for these four stages of validation, I recall, that in a way what it allows is the articulation of the concept in a way that it can be adapted to the different realities in the different contexts that it has to be applied. At the European level is very important, of course, that each country is going to have their own way. So depending on the objective that the validation process has, the focus on each of these stages is going to be a little bit different. So while if we are more interested in a formative type of validation where the key role is like for a person to identify their skills, to document, to kind of maybe go to a referral, for example, and going further in education, but they are not sure or just they want to get a job. Maybe there is more of a need of a formative kind of validation process where the person is identifying and documenting their skills. What happens, for example, in the voluntary sector a lot, where somebody has done a voluntary work and their skills are identified and they get some sort of certificate, a document from the voluntary organization that says it has acquired this or that skills. But that's very different than when we are trying to get a validation process where one is trying to get a formal qualification equivalent to, for example, a BEd degree or a higher education institution degree, you know? And that kind of validation will have more of an emphasis on the areas of assessment and certification, where the certification and the assessment of the skills is going to be much more quality assured, it's going to be much more advanced, if you want, and more complex. So it's important to keep in mind all this, because what we want to promote at the European level is the consistency across these four stages of validation, and to make sure that what you do in your identification phases and documentation, if you want, is not lost and can be used for assessment or can be used for getting a certificate eventually, but that is not necessarily the objective always of a validation process. So it's important that all these different, if you want, processes that connect or that make the invisible visible and that are connected and they are used consistently. And this, of course, the N2F have a big role to play. There is, I'm not going to go into this. I think Kun has already mentioned it a little bit. From validation, there is from 95 to now the new skills agenda. There has been a lot of developments in Europe, and I want to highlight that it takes time. At the European level, I think, as Kun has said, the 2012 recommendation play a crucial role, and we have had the European guidelines that we are updating now, as Kun said, to kind of support this process, and the European inventory, in which we have been working with ETF, that has been also kind of helping the whole process. So the European guidelines provide, if you want, those main principles that are registered in the recommendation, but it goes a little bit further. And we are updating this because it needs to be highlighted some of the, let's see, there are some, there is a need for update because there are many things here that have changing the qualification. I think that the world of qualification is changing quite a lot. So this needs to be acknowledged here. The issue of financing is not very much tackled in the current guidelines, so we need to go into this. Digitalization has evolved in the last 4 or 5 years a lot, so these issues have to be kind of highlighted. So that's why we are updating, but many of these principles remain valid, and I will discuss a little bit with the chat. When I talk about the challenges, I will present this a little bit more. Basically, all these principles are really summarized into two, that all learning, irrespective of where and when it takes place, is important, and that the formal education needs to be complemented with formal and informal learning. And it's important to mention this complementarity, because sometimes I think there is a tendency to think that validation is competing, if you want, with formal education system. But what is important to highlight is that we see them as complementary. There is a lot of information on the European inventory. The ETF has been working with us and the European Commission. We have been working very well together in developing this. And as I say, I'm very happy that ETF is thinking of expanding it to kind of get more countries, because of course, the more information we have, the better, and more we can learn from each other. Very quick, because I am running out of time and I really like to have time for questions and answers. The lessons learned, I would say, and this relates to the principles in a way, what we have seen is that it is very important to have individual support, and guidance and counsel is going to play a major role. And as I was saying, very important to determine in the validation process what is the ultimate goal of this validation system, because there's going to be different things. But what is important is that connection between the different parts of the validation system, and that will be what, in a way, this stakeholder involvement and a strategic approach to validation is going to give us. And that's where we are now, in a way, trying to develop networks, develop community of practices, and kind of, I think the recommendation has helped in developing this common understanding of validation. And of course, the use of NQF and learning outcomes is crucial. We need to make sure that, I think this is a very important tool to connect, as I say, all these different contexts. Here, and you have access to the European inventory, so you can see it more. There are some examples where I think the specific countries that are really also how these different aspects, let's say, are highlighted. And today you will have a presentation from Sweden that I think is quite interesting. I think also Poland is coming in to present. So it will be, I won't say much more on that. And just to conclude now, a little bit on the challenges for the future, in a way, what we are seeing, that is the key issues that we are facing. As Kun said, there was a 2018 evaluation of the 2012 recommendation on validation. And in a way, what we see is there's a lot of going on. The countries are progressing. There is, to some extent, a lot of the stages, let's say, a lot of the legal frameworks are there. The procedures are there, but there is still quite a lot of challenges to highlight. I think the first one is really the idea of reducing complexity. Validation is a complex issue. I think maybe I have presented very quick, but I think there is a lot of stakeholders involved. There is a lot of sectors in a lot of contexts. There is a diversity of individual needs that need to be addressed. There is a need for different professionals. So there is quite a lot of variety, a large variety of people, in a way, that are involved. And this needs to be reduced. And I think in this issue of reducing complexity and kind of making validation user-friendly, and again, individual-centered, it needs to be kind of, we need to figure out how do we have still quality assurance and complex systems, but that the individual can really access easily and be aware of. Because one of the things that we have seen is there is not, we believe still, there is a big room for improvement in terms of awareness raising and how many people can go through validation. The second key issue, I think, for the future is to assure that we have agreed standards, and that there are some reference points. The issue of using learning outcomes is here fundamental, and we have to go deeper into how are these learning outcomes defined, how do we make sure that these learning outcomes are used, how do we make sure that the individual also is supported in identifying and documenting these learning outcomes. So standards will be a key issue, and here, again, the work across different stakeholders is fundamental. In connection to standards, of course, is how do we measure all those standards? How do we measure all those learning outcomes? And here is where valid and reliable tools are going to be crucial. What we have seen in the inventory is that there is a variety of tools out there. There is more and more self-evaluation tools available that are an interesting, I think, an interesting aspect or an interesting addition, let's say, to a more formalized systems of assessment. But I think that we have to go deeper into what makes a tool valid, and especially how do we make sure that non-formal and informal learning that has certain characteristics that are different than the formal system are actually being assessed, and is not, we cannot use the traditional test always, because actually many people that would benefit a lot from validation are those precisely that have not been able to do those formal tests and use those formal validation assessments. So we need to devise new ways of reliable and valid tools and make sure with research that these tools work. And finally, and I think that Kun was also mentioning, there is a big variety now of digitalization and certification of skills. In a way, there is a boom, if you want, for certification. So I think there is a new frontier on how certification and qualifications are developed. And in here, we need to kind of see in what way validation can support and can use, let's say, these kind of new ways of certifying the skills and documenting the skills. So again, micro-credentials will have an important role to play here, but also these self-evaluation tools that I was talking, badges, and kind of these new forms of learning, if you want, or new forms, well, it's not so new, but ICT learning now will have to be playing a role. So I think I have gone over the 10 minutes I wanted to talk. There are some reference, and I just want to conclude to invite you all to Iceland. We are working together with some other organizations in developing the Biennale, the validation of prior learning Biennale, and it will be in May 19 and 20. And we will be very happy to have you in Reykjavik with us. So with that, I conclude, and I'm happy to, I hope I haven't gone too much into overtime, and that we have some time for questions and answers. Thank you very much. Arjun, back to you.
Thank you, Ernesto. And I don't see any questions yet coming in the chat, but I have a question for you. Actually, this is about this complexity issue, and of course, this issue of the individual. So what is actually going to be proposed here as concrete measures? How will individuals get easier access to validation? How many people do we know ourselves who've gone through validation processes? There's still too little. So we need more of this validation, and how is this going to happen?
Well, that's the 1 million question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but it's a very good question. I think that there are several things that we have to do, and I think all the principles in a way are hopefully going in the direction, because I think the key is that we cannot focus only on one aspect, so there's no one answer to this. Is really we have to work on the system, on all these different principles that I was talking about. I think that the key is precisely to work on all those. But I think that one of the things that we are seeing is what is important is that validation is not isolated, and it works together with other policies like guidance, financing, but also labor market, active labor market policies, that it works together with that kind of in order to really make it a reality. So I think there is a lot of work to be done. We know also that awareness raising is an issue. We know that, as I was saying, there is a need, let's say, for integrating it more into the system, but I think it kind of, you need to work on it in many different aspects. And again, I hope that the guidelines are providing some of that answer to a large extent. That's my quick answer. I could go on and on.
Thank you. I think probably there will be another version of the guidelines in a few years. We'll probably address some of those issues and the lessons learned from the work done that is now starting. elsewhere. And that brings us actually to the next presentation, which is the core presentation for us. And then also we're going to look at these examples from the concrete countries. We're moving a little bit away from the systems towards also how they are developing. And I would like to give the floor to Annie Kartunen and to Maria Rosenstock, who have been carrying out the cross-country study. Without further ado, let's get started with this cross-country study and let's see what were the findings of the validation in the neighborhood. Annie, I think you're starting, yes?
Maria is starting.
Maria is starting. Okay, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arjen. Good morning, dear partners. Thank you for joining us today. Annie and I will present the findings of cross-country study. And now I see I have issues with sharing my slides. Can I please request the contractor, maybe technicians, to share their screen? It did work before, but somehow technology does fail sometimes. It's coming. Thank you very much. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And I will start with a little bit of a background information. In the last few years, ETF partner countries have introduced education and qualification system reforms inspired by the EU policies, of which we have just heard from Ernesto and Koen. Our partner countries established qualification frameworks, and together with establishing the frameworks, there came this principle on lifelong learning and on the possibility of awarding qualifications through non-standard routes, including validation. In the last couple of years, our partner countries started working on roadmaps, on looking for institutional home for validation. They developed regulations, trained practitioners, and worked on validation schemes. Next slide, please. Our study had several objectives. We wanted to look at the stage of those developments. We intended also to find out what are the features of those systems. Validation systems vary quite a lot between countries, but even between different systems within countries. We intended to see if there are potential bottlenecks, but also identify good practices to share. And this all to develop policy recommendations for further systems to support policy dialogue, mutual learning. We've built on the European inventory of validation, the very rich depository source of information on the validation systems in partner countries. As it has been mentioned already, in 2018, ETF has joined with reports on Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Turkey. And last year's study covered Azerbaijan, Georgia, Jordan, Moldova, and Ukraine. These are the countries covered with this analysis. We will include further partner countries this year, and ultimately ETF is planning to monitor developments in all ETF partner countries. Next slide. We would like to acknowledge the good work of our national experts. We had a team of experts who collected information in the countries. We've really enjoyed collaboration with you. Some of them, I hope most of them, are with us today. And Annie and myself provided guidance to this work and worked on the cross-country analysis. Next slide. With regard to methodology, the national experts carried out desk research and interviewed key stakeholders in their countries. And the final products, which ETF will publish, will include cross-country report and country fact sheets. The summary of findings that will be included in a cross-country report and the fact sheets have already been shared with you together with the invitation for this webinar. And I think our colleague Alina can also, yes, share these files now in the chat. Next slide. And over to Annie.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria. So the analysis covered quite a lot of different things and different aspects regarding validation in those target countries. First of all, of course, we wanted to know what's happening in validation in the different education sectors. and the labor market, and the third sector, or the NGOs. Then, of course, we were interested in understanding what kind of standards were used, whether they were occupational or educational standards, or whatever the standard situation with the standards was. Then, obviously, as mentioned earlier on, quality assurance is a very important part of validation. So we wanted to also know a little bit about that, and about funding issues. Who are the practitioners, and what is the status quo with the practitioners? Are they being trained? Are they getting training on validation issues? And of course, information and guidance are really relevant in terms of validation in all countries. And obviously, stakeholder cooperation. Then the third sort of pillar that we wanted to know about was the actual practices. How is validation carried out? Are there guidelines? Who are the beneficiaries of validation? Are there any sort of targeted beneficiary groups who are sort of invited to validation procedures? And what are the outputs, or what are the outcomes of validation? So this is the entire picture of the sort of the reports and the information that we wanted to dig out from the countries via this work. Next slide, please. So then we go to the findings, the actual meat on the bones, so to say. I'm happy to say that there has been quite a lot of progress in terms of adaptation of new legislation in all of the countries. Some of the countries have sort of built up upon existing or older legislation that they have revamped or redone completely. And in other countries, there have been new sectors that the legislation concerns. but in all the 5 countries, there have been quite a lot of different kinds of legislative revamping, I would say, and also there is quite a lot of pending legislation that hasn't been still implemented. In terms of the different sectors, education sectors, vocational education and training is the educational sector that the validation covers the most. I mean, all the countries have, to some extent, systems in place in terms of VET, or at least legislation concerning the VET sector. In general education, this was quite interesting from my viewpoint, that in many of the sort of old Eastern European countries, there are these so-called extramural examinations, which means that you can attend these national standardized tests on different levels of general education without actually attending training, formal training at all. And even though this doesn't really necessarily address validation of non-formal and informal learning as such, as a system, but still it's a way of showing that you do have certain, at least knowledge, not necessarily so much skills, but at least knowledge, theoretical knowledge on certain things in general education. And this was present in many of the target countries that we were looking at. Then higher education, there were quite a lot of developments, especially I mean in Ukraine, for example, the sort of in the quality assurance processes, for example, higher education was quite prevalent in the system, that it was recommendation that higher education should actually engage themselves more and more towards validation of non-formal and informal learning. And then adult education, it was in a way kind of almost non-existent. There was a lot of discussion about adult education as such. And there were some laws that were pending regarding adult education and validation. But this was somehow, I don't know if, because adult education as such is quite a difficult term to define, because sometimes adult education can be incorporated in VET or general education or higher education. But well, what does it mean in different countries? That we did not look at. But obviously, adult education is something that needs to have a lot of focus on in the future, whether it's encompassed in the other sectors, educational sectors. Then obviously the national qualifications framework were looked at, because ETF has done quite a lot of work on the NQFs in these target countries for some time. However, the conclusion was that there was not a very sort of strong connection between the validation systems and the NQFs. And so maybe there is something that could be strengthened a little bit and open up a little bit. What does it mean to have validation, and how to improve access to validation, and how to incorporate this whole system so that it's flawless in terms of validation. And then obviously we looked at the labor market and third sector. I was quite happy to see that there were a few countries that actually were very heavily targeting on the labor market and validation, which is not so common in the EU countries, for that matter. And there were quite interesting examples of certification through labor market activities, especially in Ukraine and in Jordan. The third sector, it's sort of like more of a supporting sector in all the countries. All countries mentioned that it's an important sector, but that not actual validation is going on there, but it's more towards guidance or steering the people who engage in third sector activities towards validation, or it's about competence development in general. Okay, these were the main findings. There are quite a lot of more if you look into the report, but we can go to the next slide, please. Then about a few words about access, because access obviously is a really important thing in terms of implementation. Of course, the systems are not comprehensive, so they do not cover all sectors, or educational sectors, or labor markets, or the third sector in any of the countries. And there is something maybe to be wished for in the coverage of different sectors in terms of validation, so that maybe countries should take a close look at what are the most important sectors that actually benefit the individuals in our country, for example. Then also too, what types of qualification and what levels of qualifications were available for validation. In some countries, they were quite limited in terms of numbers. What qualifications were available for validation, and in some countries, the systems, how a qualification was approved for validation, there were quite stringent measures so that a qualification would become sort of available. This should be sort of widened all over. This should be definitely the next step, to widen the range of qualifications and qualification levels as well. And one thing that was really sort of important in terms of accessibility is the geographical accessibility, because in many countries it seemed that validation was only available in the biggest cities of the countries, the sort of the hubs, And this is not very healthy from the individual viewpoint. The next slide, please. We were looking at some of the hindering factors in the study. And in terms of legislation, there was quite a lot of legislation, and wide legislation, and also detailed legislation concerning validation. But in any of the countries, it wasn't somehow a mandate to have a validation processes carried out, or it wasn't embedded in the sort of educational sector, because usually, oftentimes the legislation concerned different education sectors, and it wasn't somehow embedded in the educational processes. Neither did the legislation provide a lot of incentive either. So if it's just an option in the legislation, there is such thing as validation, so it's not maybe implemented as it should be. Then there was sort of lack of profiles of beneficiaries. It was quite unclear, who are we targeting in our system? Who are the most important beneficiaries in our system? Upskilling was always mentioned, but if it's unemployed, if it's migrants, refugees, if it's, who is it? So there was no profiling, clear profiling of that. And of course, then information guidance leads to sort of, if there's lack of information and guidance, it leads to low awareness of the system as well, both for the actual users, and also some institutions are not necessarily aware that they can implement validation. Then obviously funding is a big question. It wasn't incentivizing either for the provider or the individual, because there were fees, or there were lots of fees for the providers to have their organization accredited for validation, and many reported that smaller organizations couldn't even afford the accreditation fees. It was a very sort of heavy process in terms of that. So funding needs to be rethought. Also standards, as I mentioned before, there were quite few standards in some countries. Only a few available standards you could be validated against. So this has to be addressed quite soon. And then one issue is, of course, and this has to do with the quality assurance as well, support to practitioners. There were some initial training and testing for practitioners in the very first phases of validation, but then there was no sort of indication of any further training or peer support, or systematic approach to support to practitioners who operate with validation. And the stakeholder collaboration was quite varied in different countries, and this is an important factor, because stakeholder collaboration promotes trust towards the system. So the more people are collaborating in terms of validation, then the more trust it gains, and it seems to be quite fragmented in many countries, that there are several ministries and several organizations, and so in some cases even work-life organizations, but their roles were not very clearly defined. What is their role and what is their mandate in the system? So this should be improved and looked at in the countries, as in many European countries as well. Thank you. And then, as stated before, that there was no particular sort of profile for the candidates or the beneficiaries. Who are they? So you have to really think about this from the viewpoint of who needs it the most. Some people need easy access. So these were the geographic, for example, the geographical impediments. There needs to be guidance. Not all adult people or professionals either are very sort of self-steering in terms of validation. It's not that easy a process to look at your own competencies and skills and assess what does it mean. So a lot of guidance is needed. Then we need to have user-friendly processes that are supporting the candidates and do not cost overly much. Then, of course, you need further learning paths that are tied to the validation process. So if a person can, for example, get a partial qualification or a module of a qualification, then, but not everything. So there has to be a further learning path available for the person to sort of cover the gaps. And then obviously the funding that I discussed earlier on, this needs to be somehow thought over, because I mean, according to quite a lot of evidence, if a person is validated and gets a qualification or even a partial qualification or a certificate to, for example, an occupational license that I used, for example, in Jordan, and to get a job, then it's quite beneficial for the society. So you have to start thinking in terms of what is beneficial in terms of economics as well. So really pinpointing who are the most important candidates in the system. And now over to Maria.
Maria, are you, and can we close, because there are a lot of discussion also on the chat. I think we need some time to come back to that too.
We will come back. I see there are discussions. Can I please have the previous slide on quality assurance? Thank you. Can validation results be trusted? We have seen a lot of effort, very commendable effort, that our partner countries studied have put into assuring, in principle, the credibility of assessment, which is the core element of validation, and also to assure that the institutions which provide validations are actually capable to do so. This has taken place through the use of standards, even though, as Annie mentioned, there are sometimes bottlenecks with regard to how many standards, revised and reformed standards are in place, through authorization of providers, and through very reinforced rules related to assessment. I sometimes had the thought when I was reading the national reports that the assessment for validation can really be a model for assessment systems in vocational education in general, in the sense how much industry experience is required from assessors, that assessment items, banks, instruments are being developed. But there is a price of those and maybe there is some space to work further on simplification. So some of the national reports mentioned that the procedures of authorization for providers are quite burdensome, and they can actually discourage many of institutions from applying for a status of validation body. Also, with regard to assessment, there is still an adherence to this traditional division into theoretical assessment and practical assessment, even though the practical part is very much highlighted. But as Ernesto mentioned before, for many of potential candidates for validation, this type of assessment might maybe not be the most suitable, especially for those who had in the past a negative or not so successful experience in education. As far as we look at the elements that are somehow less considered currently, and this is probably normal because the validation systems are very new, we see a need to work further on further training for practitioners. As Annie said, all partner countries considered some forms of initial training for validation practitioners, but in none of the countries studied, our national experts found evidence or thinking about future needs of those validation practitioners. Also, with regard to impact monitoring, this is a challenge also in the European member states. We do not have enough data on the outputs, on outcomes, on the profile of beneficiaries, how they benefited. So we would like to encourage thinking about these aspects. And in general, also to look at the quality assurance systems more as the systems which should support not only the trust building, this is crucial, of course, in the beginning, but as the mechanisms that support this continuous improvement of quality. And they should look at all levels, at the level of regulation, at the level of processes, whether processes are user-friendly, whether they work well for the candidates, at the level of practitioners, and then outputs and outcomes. Next slide, please. Is there a business case for providers? We have already mentioned this, and we do see a need to look at the level of providers. This is somehow not maybe considered very strongly in this initial phase. Providers, once they are awarded the status of validation body, are pretty much left on their own with regard to information, outreach to candidates, carrying out assessment, and they have to fund these processes through fees, almost exclusively through fees. And the way it happens is that providers include in their costing only the cost of the assessment, but assessment is not the only cost which they will bear with regard to their validation services. In some countries, the fees are set up low, not to discourage candidates, but then they do not even cover full cost of assessment. In such case, the providers use their training budget, the regular budget. In Moldova, it was mentioned, for example, that because especially public providers are not allowed to draw any profit, there might not have a great motivation to further scale up the systems. So we have noticed that there might be really a need for support to providers, for looking at their perspective and provide dedicated funding for validation, to support them with strategic partnerships, but also encourage development of more guidelines and also networking among them, and not to provide too much burden for them with regard to the accreditation procedures. Next slide, please. Funding. We've said already a lot about funding, but it is the crucial element. And as the European experience shows, without dedicated funding, it will be very difficult to scale up validation systems. Donor funding has been used to start, and we encourage further international collaboration. We also believe that there will be more opportunities for that. But at the moment, there is no national funding mobilized for validation. Relying on fees only might really create potential barriers. And something that we find really very, very important is that currently there is, and maybe with exceptions with few exceptions, there is no support to disadvantaged groups. So in the European Union policies, unemployed persons, low-skilled persons, persons from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, migrants are the priority groups for validation. They are the groups that are considered that they can benefit the most from the service. At the moment, there is no support for them, so this should be addressed. And the engagement of partners, we can go to the next slide because it actually tackles it. We would like to encourage more partnerships, and we believe that partnerships beyond education sector can really address many of the issues that have been raised. So we do want to see validation embedded fully in education system and across all education subsectors. We would like to see it embedded in career guidance, in teacher training, but there are also many other policies to which validation could be linked. And we see already some attempts. For example, in Azerbaijan, it is very clear the link to economic development, to upskilling. The Quality Assurance Agency in Azerbaijan has also made an effort to collaborate with employment agency to use validation in support of entrepreneurship for persons with disabilities, for example. But going back to education development, there are really a lot of opportunities to make a business case for validation with regard to support for small and medium enterprises, with regard to projects that tackle informality, with projects that will be supporting upskilling with regard to greening of the sectors. So we see that there is really a lot of space to create partnerships, migration management as well. And if you could click now for the next part of the slide, and a few more times, please. We believe that these partnerships will support development of those missing profiles of candidates, because it is very difficult for a provider at the moment to come out with the profile of candidates. Where could our beneficiaries be? Who are they? How can we design services that really put them in the center? People from different groups will have different needs. Partnerships can also help diversifying the funding. We think that they will not replace a dedicated national funding for validation, but they can diversify funding and support this development of the right business case. Over to you, Annie.
And Annie, if you can just keep it very short, because we are about 9 minutes over and we need to discuss some of the questions in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this is just a summary of basically everything that we've already said, that you need to identify the users, who are the beneficiaries that are important in your country, link with other policies, mobilize the funding, as Maria just said, then look at the regulatory framework in terms of mandates and incentives, and then look at the quality from the system level, processes, as well as practitioner level. So there are 3 levels of quality assurance really that need to be looked at, and not to make it too heavy, but usable. Thank you, very shortly.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a very interesting slide, actually. We should come back to that also later, because it really shows that the focus should be on people, and the policies have to be formed around them, and the legislation should not come up front, but rather let's see how these things can be implemented and then legislate them. So I think that's very important. There were a lot of questions in the chat. I think so some we need to return because they are quite important. So there was first a question about what's the difference between independent assessment and validation. So I think Ernesto has been very active in answering many of these questions. Of course, there is a difference in terms of the validation and valuation. Sometimes the term is giving value to the invisible, as was to the learning that is taking place, and it's not here to assess people, but it's more to certify, to confirm what they have learned. So also that has an impact on the ways we assess. Yeah, so it's not the traditional ways of assessment that is very important. Then let me see, we had some other ones about cross-country results. And I think these are the same problems actually that we face also with qualification systems. Where do we recognize these results cross-country? And of course, for that, you need to have, let's say, common language, common principles, and that's why actually we are cooperating. And we see that there's a lot of interest for cooperation between the staff. Now, can I see if there was a question from Rodion from Ukraine about, are there any methods to deal with this massive number of people coming into the EU in making sure that they are validated?
Yes. It's a very relevant question, and it will be test not so much for our partner countries, but it will be a test for validation system in the member state countries. Fortunately, there are a lot of practices already developed in the European member states. But also among our partner countries, we did see projects and quite impressive results with regard to working with refugees. For example, in Jordan, 18,000 Syrian refugees and Jordanian hosts also have been certified with the support of international projects carried out by ILO. But also Moldova. Moldova has been very successful in scaling up validation systems, and this has also been supported by projects which target migration management. So there are already examples coming out, and of course we are sure that there will be more work. Maybe during the panel discussion we'll also have a chance to ask partners from Moldova about it.
Yes, and then there was also a comment more than or also a sort of invitation by Vladica Stojanovic, who said, look, we are working on these issues. How can we actually share our experiences? I think that will be really very important, because we see now that there actually are answers to questions that people have. There are many challenges. There are sales challenges also in the most developed countries, but there are also answers, and it's important that we start, let's say, seeing how we can have a more active exchange of experiences. So that was all that I want to cover, because I think there is not much time left before we have to now for this panel, the panel that we have until the coffee break. So what I would just like to say is that we had invited 4 people to speak about their experience, but unfortunately, Volodymyr Kuftinets, he wrote that he could not make it. He's actually had to go to a funeral. It was not linked to the war directly, but he had to travel, and this is very dangerous now in Ukraine at the moment. So he cannot be here. He's traveling, but I would like to say some words, and maybe Rodion also, he's here. He was very important, especially in the beginning of these developments. So we had the law on professional developments, which was adopted in 2012 in Ukraine, and really the work started from there. We had done some piloting around cooks, and in 2016, the State Employment Service started to develop a system in Ukraine, a system for cooks, and it was mainly aimed at unemployed people. Mainly, majority of them are women, and they are looking for a job, and they need to have a qualification to be cook. So there are 3 centers in Odessa, Kiev, and Rivne, and they have so far qualified almost 700 people. Now, in 2017, Ukraine adopted a very modern law on education with a very strong lifelong learning focus, also addressing some new features, competency-based education, not only general education, VET and higher education, and adult learning, and also establishing a new entity, the National Qualifications Agency. And that agency is now going to be responsible for accrediting qualification centers. These qualification centers, they have been legislated. The procedure for that has been agreed last year, and it's now being put into practice. Although, of course, with the war, this has now, let's say, been it's not been interrupted actually, because they're training people now how to do this, and it will be very important if there will be peace soon also for the reconstruction. Also because many people in Ukraine may not return, or they will have to find other employment. Also because many factories have been bombed. So it is very important that there is a system for validation in Ukraine. Now, I want to move now to the other countries, and I would like to invite Galina Rusu. Galina, you are the State Secretary of the Ministry of Education and Research, and I really want to congratulate you. I read the report on Moldova. I've been working with Moldova in the past, and you really have done miracles in the last year. You already have addressed 300 candidates, and you have services available in 46 different trades. And you have 8 or 9, validation centers in these centers of excellence running. So congratulations, that's really a very fast start. So what are now the areas where you're going to focus on for the further development?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Are you also thinking about using validation for the Ukrainian refugees in Moldova?
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to mention that it is a great pleasure to participate at this event and to find information about this procedure in other countries, EU countries and neighborhoods one. Also I would like to mention that the Ministry of Education and Research pays a special attention to strengthening and extending the mechanisms for validation of professional skills. Yes, you mentioned that we have Okay, not so big numbers, but we have some numbers of citizens of Republic of Moldova and migrants that are now which competencies we have validated. I would say that we are not so old in this domain, starting to pilot the regulation and really working in only 2019 till now. Yes, I want to say that this year in 2022, we managed to open a new center of validation in energetics or electroenergetics because we had some we identified not only we Ministry of Education and Research, but the Center of Excellence and the people identified the need in validation in concerning this use of photovoltaic batteries and so on. So regenerable energy, so very actual directions. At this moment, unfortunately, yes, I can state that we have not so good policies, yes, in financing of this direction, but of course we understand the need and we will work on this direction. Also, I would like to say that the direction of higher education is also thinking. So at this moment, we are piloting the regulation adopted in 2018. And at the end of this piloting period in May, June this year, we are going to go through this regulation and to improve it according to the reports on the project. Yes, also I am sure that we will take into account some moments that we found today in the presentations. So we are going to improve the regulation that we have piloted. And I was mentioning that the direction of higher education, I mean that at this moment we are working on validation of the ESED level 3 to 5. Yes, I would like to mention that we have more on the third level, not less in the level 4 and 5, but even having this situation, the higher education, I mean the level 6, yes, also is thinking and is working on a regulation of validation specific skills, not all of them, but specific skills also through this procedure. Also, I would like to mention that in Moldova, we are working only with centers that are accredited. So we are not working with centers, I don't know, but if they have accreditation for, let me call normal, but I believe that validation of the competencies will become normal, also a normal fact, but we are working only with centers which are accredited. Just not to have very much time, but I would like to mention that we are working in this direction on the National Agency for Employment. And if to speak about the addressed question with the Ukrainian refugees, yes, this our regulation can work, let me say like this, can work with Moldova citizens and not only, so we have no interdiction by regulation. The only interdiction, not interdiction, but challenge that we have is the payment. And in this direction, yes, we have some discussions with the National Agency for Employment and with the organization, International Organization for Migration, to find support in order to support, to validate the competencies of the refugees from Ukraine. So, and at the moment, starting with last week, we are working on the instruction. So yes, we can do it if we find support, and yes, we found the support in this direction, but we also are working on a short instruction to the refugees, because at the moment we have around 100,000 of migrants, refugees from Ukraine in Moldova. So these validated skills will be, I think it depends on the time that they will be in our country, but yes, will be at great help, at big help, I think. Yes, thank you.
Mulțumesc.
Oh, yeah, you're so good in Romanian.
Okay, so I would like to move on to the next country. We actually have some issues here also that was mentioned. Just one question for you, but it's not that you need to answer it now. It's from a question from a colleague from, I think, from Azerbaijan, who asked about the legal basis for your, or maybe from Kazakhstan, for your validation. So could you share it? Do you have it also in Russian? I think you have a lot of legislation also in Russian. Do you have that?
Unfortunately, this regulation is in Romanian.
Okay,
and,
but
yeah.
If we can share it, then we could see how it can be translated, maybe also with Google Translation, etc. Thank you very much. We're going to Azerbaijan. Nijat Asadi, she's a member of the management board of the Education Quality Assurance Agency. This agency, he's the manager of that, and this agency is running the validation of non-formal informal learning. Nijat, can I ask you, so the implementation of validation in Azerbaijan, it started last year. How far has the system been developing since last year? Have you been able to increase the demand for validation? And also, who are actually the candidates for this system? Could you answer this question?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question, Aryan. I'd also like to thank everyone for the study who has participated. It's actually very enlightening, insightful. And some of the things I'm going to say has already been mentioned by Maria and Anni. It just shows that how the study is correct and comprehensive, and it's covering our country as well. To answer your question, I'd like to start with a simple statistic. In Azerbaijan, 67% of people do not have any qualification in the field that they are working. So verification of non-formal and informal learning plays a crucial role, and it's very important for our country in this aspect. But the problem at the moment with that is the problem that was already mentioned is awareness. So since we started it last year, not a lot of people know that we actually have this process in place. So we have problem with reaching out to the right people, finding our audience and addressing them. So this year, our main target is identifying these people, these places, so that we can actually be more effective. Last year, what we did was, since we were new, it was for us maybe a practical process, a pilot project that we tried adopting it from the European experience. And we learned through this process the challenges that we actually had, the more important things that we should focus on. Last year, we only gave about 11 diplomas and around 20 certificates, but there were a total of 346 applicants. The main reason that we only gave out the validation to 31 people is most of them declined to participate by themselves. So when we told them about the cost that is associated with the validation, they withdrew their application. I've discussed this with Maria before we had the extensive interview, and I told her as well. So I guess the cost would be the main issue for us. And we're working with private sector participants, actually large corporations, to be able to get funding for the people who cannot afford the cost associated with the validation. So we're looking forward to continue doing that, because last year we were able to, as Maria mentioned, attract this I guess, sponsors who were interested in paying for the participants in the validation process. Last year, we did that, and this year we're going to continue doing that. We're aiming to reach the benchmark of 1,000 certificates. Last year it was 100, and reached that target in the number of certificates, not in the number of people, obviously. But this year, to reach this 1,000 benchmark, we're also working to change the legal framework. So another issue associated with our country is, Ani also mentioned this earlier, is the legal status of our documents. I'll just give a number. So among hundreds of professions, we're only able to give diplomas to 14 professions. So this diploma in 14 professions allows them to continue their education and gain a legal status regarding their profession, but the other professions were only able to give out a certificate. Certificate doesn't have any legal basis. It does not allow the applicant to continue his or her education or work. So the second issue, I guess, after the cost would be this legal status. For this regard, to those countries who want to implement RPL, I think they should seriously consider the second issue very closely. They should use either of the two approaches, as it was mentioned earlier. I just want to go over it again in our personal experience. First is incentives, motivation, and second is regulation. The motivation in our country that would work, that we have identified, is the legal basis for further education, the work permission, perhaps tax cuts in their area of profession, also some employment opportunities, because right now this year we're working with with the biggest supermarket in Azerbaijan, and we're going to do tests for the cashiers, and in our contract they have taken the responsibility to employ everybody who has acquired the validation from us as their employee. So this has played a crucial role in attracting applicants to that process. I guess for now, it is the main problems, the main targets for us are this.
Thank you. And thank you for answering also this question about, now you use also a digital system. Does that create any problems with access for candidates? Do people have difficulties to get into it? Is it making it easier to reach people because you can go register from your own desk, or is it making it more difficult because people lack the skills and to enter into this? Could you comment?
The thing is, the digital system is not introduced yet fully. We have finished preparing it, but it's not in full use right now. We have created a digital testing environment for the applicants who are not able to, we also discussed this earlier in this meeting, that who are in regions who cannot attend the test physically, they can use the digital testing system. But we're planning to introduce the system until probably end of next month. But in our experience, yes, digitalization is good, but I don't think it should be a priority. In our understanding, it's just a tool, because we did a couple of surveys and interviews with applicants, and what they're looking for is actually some kind of benefit, an end result that they're going to get at the end of the verification of their learning. So to those, again, countries who are, I saw someone wrote in the chat that they're at the beginning stage of this RPL process. My suggestion to them would be, if they have limited resources that they can use towards this process, I think they should focus on more important things. They should prioritize their targets and mainly focus on what, as everybody mentioned earlier, what will the applicant, how the applicant will benefit from this process. And then again, I'm going back to the two things that I mentioned. First, if they can, they should they should somehow cover the cost for the applicants or some part of it so that they can be interested, so they don't get demotivated. And then the second part is obviously attract some international experts, national experts, so they can change their legal framework to give them a status, to give them some kind of benefit, motivation in this process. So when we finish the digital system, we're going to announce it in the media. So I hope everybody participating here can get to take a glance at it, maybe give us a feedback on what they think about it and how we can improve it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going straight to Georgia, our last example. Just before we break, this is, I have two colleagues here, Nina Dalakishvili, she is the head of the TVET Quality Assurance Department, and Londa Mindlashvili, she is the coordinator for the validation process. I start with Londa. Londa, what has changed in your system? Because you already introduced a few years ago, it didn't really take off in terms of practical things. It has worked very well, I think, in general education, in fact, not so much. What have you changed and what did you prioritize in your system recently?
Thank you. Hello. The recognition of non-formal education system is rather new in our country. It was introduced in 2019. The regulations, the rules allow for any applicants to get their learning outcomes recognized to any formal vocational education qualifications. It would be basic, secondary, or higher vocational education qualifications. And the validation is done against the existing education standards, models, or also vocational training and retraining programs. And the process consists of identification, documenting, assessment, recognition, and validation of learning outcomes. The recognition of non-formal education process is automatized in our country. And applications, also portfolios and results are registered through the special electronic system. The recognition of non-formal education is implemented by bodies licensed, especially licensed by NCEK, a national quality assurance and qualifications body. Only institutions having a right to provide officially recognized vocational educational qualifications are eligible to obtain the right for the recognition of non-formal education within the fields of their current education programs. The right for validation of non-formal or informal learnings has been granted to only 5 institutions in Georgia, and the consultation and documentation process is conducted by a consultant, specially trained and certified also by NCEK. Currently, there are 51 validation consultants in the country, and the recognition of non-formal education system, as I also mentioned, is rather new. Unfortunately, we don't have any validation cases yet, unfortunately.
This was actually my question to Nani. Thank you very much. But Nani, what do you expect? What do you expect is going to happen? What are you going to do to get these? Because now you have the system in place. You have the legislation, you have the 5 centers, you have the 51 validation consultants. When are we going to see the candidates, and who are you going to address? Who are the candidates you want to attract to this? Who are the people you want to offer this opportunity to? How is this going to happen?
Thank you for question. Progress, unfortunately, now is minimal in our country. Londa said that we have 5 institutions have obtained the right to recognition non-formal and informal education. One of them is in the region, and 4 are in Tbilisi. Validation services available in 9 areas of study that are information and communication technologies, personal services, engineering and engineering case, including automotive repair, security services, education, healthcare, architecture and construction, agriculture, business and the administration. But as Londa said, only 1 application was submitted in the field of automotive services, which is currently underway, not under yet. We expected applications in the field of personal services, especially in the field of hair and beauty, because this field is saturated with people with non-formal education, but we don't have any applications. We also expected applications in auto service and construction, also because the sectors also are saturated with people with non-formal education. I agree with the presenter, with Eni, that there is a lack of awareness for employers and applicants about the opportunities for validation of non-formal education in our country. We think that until the government determines that at least in central sectors, employees must have qualification documents, the issue of recognition of non-formal education will not be activated. I think financial support would also be an important step in validation issues and in this activation steps in future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, this issue of the business case for validation is very important. It's not only just a question of putting in place the processes, the competent assessors, the assessment centers. It's very important that we think about who are these and who are these applicants. And I think this roadmap that was shown at the end of the presentation by Maria and by Annie is really, in that sense, maybe a good way forward that we should unpack further. And now we have still a short video. Are we going to show it, or where are we with the time? Because we are a bit over time. Will we show it or not?
I think we can show the video. We show the video, and we can also let our participants to take a short break.
Yes, so we are going to be back here in, I think, in probably 10:45, so in 8 minutes. Take it easy, look at the video, and take a break, and see you back soon.
People learn all the time.
And people learn everywhere.
Not just in the classroom, but also on the job and through their life experiences.
If lifelong learning is to become a reality for all, people need to be able to build on the competencies they have, regardless of how they acquire them.
That is why the validation of non-formal and informal learning is a vital part of a lifelong learning ecosystem.
It enables people to identify, document, assess, and certify their competences in order to build towards further qualifications.
Formally recognizing what people already know and can do makes them aware of their own strengths and motivates them to engage with further training.
It gives a second chance to those who didn't succeed in traditional educational settings.
It allows workers to comply with new certification requirements.
It enables migrants to make immediate use of the skills they bring to a new country.
It empowers people of all ages to develop their skills in more flexible ways and improve their life chances.
A number of things need to be in place for this to work effectively. People need information, guidance, counseling, and access to flexible learning pathways adapted to their needs.
Qualifications need to be modular, with clear defined competency standards.
Assessment needs to be transparent, objective, and reliable.
Key actors from education, the labour market and industry need to be involved.
And above all, the system needs resources, both funding and competent personnel.
We need to design systems that work for people.
And there needs to be something in it for those people, in terms of recognition of what they can do and flexible learning pathways towards qualifications.
The post-COVID recovery and the green and digital transition will require a massive effort to upskill and reskill people who have missed out on education and training.
Or whose jobs are impacted by industrial change.
Assessing and validating the competences people already possess reduces the cost of further learning for individuals and society.
Establishing a system for validating non-formal and informal learning is a vital step towards building a culture of lifelong learning.
It opens doors to opportunities for people of all ages and stages in life.
Thank you. Have a nice break.
Okay, I think it's time to start after the break. I will moderate the second part of our event. I hope that you did manage to have a short break from the screen. In the second part of the event, we will have the pleasure to showcase 3 innovative practices, and we will start with funding. We mentioned that funding is a challenge, that in general, there is a lack of national dedicated funding. This is also a challenge in the countries of the European Union. And we have a pleasure to have Anna Karlsson from the Swedish National Agency for Higher Vocational Education to present a policy experimentation with the agency recently carried out, which also shows some very promising results with regards to funding. Anna, welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for this opportunity to present what we're doing in Sweden in regards to higher vocational education and validation. My name is Anna Karlsson, and I'm from the, as Maria said, the national agency responsible for the higher vocational education system in Sweden. We also work with a few other things. And I think that the organizer will show my slides. So if we could get them up, and then let's get started. Thank you. So let's dive right in and go to the first slide. Just to give you a quick overview about our agency, we are an agency under the Ministry of Education and Science here in Sweden. And we are not a big agency, but we have a lot of things to do. So we can quickly just go to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're actually working on. So we are responsible, as perhaps our name indicates, for higher vocational education in Sweden. But we do a lot more things than just work with the higher vet system. We are also responsible for post-secondary arts and culture courses in Sweden, and we are also responsible for interpretation courses and programs. And in addition to that, and that's where I mainly work, we are responsible for working with validation of prior learning in Sweden. We are coordinating and following national and regional developments. When it comes to validation of prior learning here in Sweden, we are responsible for working with industry sectors in Sweden when it comes to their work on validation. And we are, of course, responsible for promoting and supporting the work of validation in the parts of the education system in Sweden that we are responsible for. And last but not least, we are also the Swedish national, we are now I'm stumbling on my words. We're responsible for the Swedish National Qualification Framework, and we are the national coordination point for the EQF. And more we see that we this is a good thing that we work with both validation of prior learning and with the qualification framework. So that's a good thing. But let's step into the subject for my presentation here today, which is validation within higher vocational education in Sweden. So if we can move one more slide. So just to give you some context about higher vocational education in Sweden, it is a part of the education system that is post-secondary, and the programs leads to qualifications or degrees at EQF level 5 and 6. It's training for very specific vocations, sometimes very, very specific and very narrow vocations. The programs are offered throughout the country, and one of the main important things about this system is that all programs respond to an actual labor market demand. This means to say that there will be no government funding or no approval from our part on programs that does not meet this requirement. And it also means that programs vary over time, because if you are approved and you get funding from us to give your program, after a couple of years, you have to reapply and again show that the program still meets a labor market demand to be able to continue give the program as a provider. What is also quite unique in this system is that the curricula or the learning outcomes for programs and courses within programs are developed by the providers. So that's also decentralized. And there is a very important cooperation between the education providers and the world of work. So for instance, employers contribute to both the shaping and running of these study programs. And employer representatives are part of the board, the governing board for each program. The programs, all of them more or less have extensive periods of work-based learning. They vary to one to 3 years in duration, and all of these programs qualify for student financing, and basically all of them are free of charge for the individual, and they are financed by a government grant that we as an agency allocate to different providers. And I also wanted to give you a few key indicators. So if we move to the next slide, some figures about this system. There are now just over 200 different providers that are both public and private. There is over 3,000 programs that were running during 2020, which is the last figure I have. I think there's a few more actually now. We have about 2 applicants that fulfill the entry requirements per financed study place. So there are more people interested in this than we unfortunately can actually train. In 2020, there was almost 80,000 active students, and in that year, 35,000 students actually started their studies. And in the year 2020, there was about 15,000 graduates, and graduation rate as a total was 71%. And what's also very important and something that we're quite proud of is the fact that almost 90% of graduates, they were in employment within a year after graduating. So these are some of the data, the information about the system, to give you some background when I'm going to tell you about what we're actually piloting. So we can go to the next slide immediately, and that's easier. So the background for what we're doing right now is that the right to a student that's enrolled in one of these programs for an exemption based on prior learning has been regulated since 2009 when the HVE system started in Sweden. And the right for that is not for a full program, but for part of the program, which in pragmatic terms means basically 99% of the program can be exempted, but not the full 100%. So this is a little bit of a regulatory specificity that's quite interesting. And the right follows, as I said, the fact that you as an individual are enrolled into one of these programs. What's not regulated is validation, or VPL, as it says, a validation of prior learning, as a specific tool or process for that. But this is something that we as an agency recommend the providers, because validation can be a structured and quality assured process of doing this work. We, over the years, we have, there's been questions about how much this right to exemption is actually used in the system. So we conducted an internal review in 2019, where this idea of what we're now doing was born. And that internal review was a little bit disheartening, because we realized that it was very, very few of the students enrolled in the programs that actually got exemptions. It was about 2 to 3% of the students, which is quite low. So we, of course, asked our providers what was the big problems for them in doing this job. And one of the answers was funding. The funding model for this was not making it easy for the providers to actually do this work, because in sometimes exempting students from big parts of programs meant that the provider actually lost funding. So it was difficult for them to actually do it. There was, of course, other issues as well, but the funding part was one of the main things that was that we were told was a problem. So based on this internal review, the idea of IHO-flex, as we call it in Swedish, was born. And we had just finalized this review and started talking about our next step when the pandemic hit. And that made the government to actually give us the task of testing this idea. So if we move to the next slide, what happened then in the start of the pandemic is that the government asked us, what can you do, and what can the higher vocational education system in Sweden do to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic in the labor market? And we told them we want to try the idea of IHO-flex. And so we were given a government assignment in the spring of 2020 to do this. And the assignment is that we are to test and develop models based on exemptions, large exemptions for people that have a lot of skills with them coming into the HIVET system, and combining those exemptions with individualized complementary training to achieve the degree or the full qualification. We are now in our, let's say, third year of this. We started in the summer of 2020, and we are going to report back to the government in about a year. And the funding we have is approximately 3 million euros for each of these years. And that money goes to funding up to 500 students per year to go through IHO-flex. And one of our tasks is to propose a permanent model for implementation within the HIVET system. We can move on to the next slide. So the aims of the pilot is that we are to develop and test a financing model that supports both validation and complementary training within the same model. And we are also to support the capacity building for the providers to do this work, to carry out validation, and to work with individualized complementary training, individualized study planning, etc. So people could, at a faster pace, in a faster route, actually gain the HIVET qualification. Part of this is, of course, that we work with developing support materials. And the whole point of this is that for people that have a lot of skills with them when they come into the HIVET system, is to recognize those skills and create a faster route to the full qualification. And then, of course, more efficient use of this government funding is part of what we're doing. And we can go to the next slide. So the model that we are testing is pictured here. And the whole training of students that come into this route is to start with the identification and assessment of their prior learning, so the validation part. That the result of the validation part is then the basis for the towards all the courses in the training program for full or parts of these courses. And based on what's then being exempted and the gap identified through that exemption towards the full qualification, there is the part where you do the individual study planning. So each student gets their own individual study plan, and then to carry out the individual complementary training. And this is of course done in very different ways in different providers based on what the students actually need to train for to gain the full qualification. But the final aim is for the students to reach the full qualification, and as I said, as hopefully at a faster pace than if they would have gone through, let's say, the normal program route. What we say about this is that the study places for students in EOFlex or HVFlex, they are linked to a specific program. So we say that it's the same learning outcomes that should be either validated or trained for. But that this flexible route has a completely flexible how and when and where. And that's what's agreed in the individual study plan. So this is the model. And if we go to the next slide, I will also tell you a little bit about the funding model, which is what actually is the innovative part, I'd say, in this. So normally, the programs in the higher vet system is funded through a fixed grant per annual study place. And that fixed grant is depending a little bit based on what type of training it is. So for instance, we have pilots being trained within the system, and that annual grant is quite higher than perhaps the annual grant for an accountant, which is also part of the system. So, but based on that annual grant, the providers get approval for, let's say, 30 study places per year, and then they get per study place that grant. And then they check twice or I think 3 times maybe a year with us. They tell us how many students are enrolled, and then they get that funding based on how many students are actually active in the programs at the moment, based on these fixed grants. But what we've done now to support the uptake of validation and support the work of the providers to actually do the validation is that we have changed this funding model so that the HVFlex study places is funded according to this model that you see here. So there is a fixed grant for 10,000 Swedish crowns per student for the validation part, and that's regardless of the results of the validation. I'd say this is about 1,000 euros. If that makes it easier for people to understand about how much money this actually is. And then for the individual complementary training, it's a variable grant based on how many credits per individuals that individual study, the individual complementary training is supposed to provide. And that grant per credit is based on this already approved annual study place grant for the specific program. And then we've also added a grant ceiling of this, that an EOFlex study place will never receive more funding than up to 75% of the regular grant per annual study place. So this we have done to create a balance and the right compensation regardless of how and when and where students are actually active in the programs and doing their complementary studies. And of course also to make sure that the validation has a good funding, so that gives a good way for the providers to actually work with validation within this model. So this is what we're doing. And then I wanted to end my presentation with sharing some of the preliminary results that we see in this. Not all students enrolled that have started this are, of course, they haven't graduated yet. They are out there doing it right now. But we see some preliminary results based on what the providers is actually telling us, and based on the individual study plans, and based on how much the providers are reporting into us that they have exempted for individuals. So what we do see is that according to the individual study plans, about 8 out of 10 of these students are planned to actually graduate faster. At this moment, I think we have about 60 to 70 students that are already have graduated that we know of, and for them we do know that this number is actually is accurate. So about 8 out of 10 students seems to be able to graduate faster through this model. On average, the students enrolled in EOFLEX have received exemptions for 50% of the programs. This, of course, varies between individuals. But as you can see here, if we look at the numbers, you see how much of the programs that have been exempted, and then how many of the students that have that. And we can see that it's about a little over half of them that have gotten more than half of their program exempted, which we think is quite a good number. And a quarter of them actually have got as high an exemption that's over 75% of the full program. So these we think are good numbers. Then we look at the money, if we go to the next slide. And the good thing about this pilot is that we can actually follow this for each individual student. And we can, of course, then compare it to what the cost would have been if they had gone through, let's say, a normal route in the HIVET system. So these are our 2 first years, so phase 1 and phase 2. And in total, this is about right over 400 students at the moment that we know this for. And we can see that what we are, let's say, saving of the funding for this is about 46%, so just under half. And when we look at these numbers, the interesting thing is here that the conclusion is that we could actually train 2 people for the cost of 1 if we do this, if we use validation in this kind of way, in a more strategic way than we have before. So we're quite happy with these results. We see that the potential savings went down in our phase 2, where there's a few more students, and we know that this is because there are more longer programs in phase 2, and the students are still getting quite large exemptions over a year of the study programs. But since the programs are longer, percentage-wise, it will be less. So we're not really worried about that it's going down in phase 2, because we see that there's still quite a lot of exemptions being done also for those students. So some of our conclusions, if we move along, is that we are pretty confident that this way of working and using exemptions, using validation for exemptions of these programs, that it does contribute to a faster and more flexible training pathway within the system. And we are quite sure also that students enrolled here will graduate faster. And the important thing with that is for these individuals, for these students, it means that they can better utilize their skills in the labor market, which is important not only for them, but for the labor market and for society as a whole. As I said, we see that the cost of the study places can be reduced with up to 50%. We do think that the further we go and the more our providers work with this, they get better at it. They will get better at recruiting students, that this is a good model for. We think that the economic efficiency will even be better. But what we definitely have learned from this is what Maria and others were talking about earlier today, the fact that funding is a key factor to increase the uptake of validation procedures. We also think the fact that this is preliminary, at least quite successful, is the fact that it encompasses both parts. So it's both the validation, but also the complementary training in one model that's kept together, and with the funding model that actually also follows the model of training people. So we do think that this is one of the key factors for the success here, that it's both these parts. It's not only validation, but it's also making sure that these individuals after the validation get the complementary training they need to achieve the full qualification. We've seen, of course, that operational support and capacity building is important. And we see that this is a model that can be implemented also in other parts of education and training system in Sweden, which is quite interesting. And we also have some questions. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things, let's see if the slides will move along. I'm not sure. Thank you. There we go. So we see that students will graduate faster, but we still don't know what the graduation rate will be. Will it be approximately the same for as all students within the system, or will it be lower or higher? This is something that we're going to have to follow over time. We also have seen an increase in large exemption, let's say, that where a big part of the training programs are actually exempted compared to what was being done before we started to test this model. And the interesting thing here is that all conditions apply as they do in the normal routes when it comes to laws, regulation, etc. The only thing that we actually have changed is the funding model. So this is also quite interesting. And the question we are asking ourselves, is funding then more important than regulation for overall uptake of validation? That's one of our questions that we don't really have an answer, but this is something that we're thinking about. We talk a lot about how to actually measure the flexibility in this system, and this is not an easy nut to crack, let's say. But what we see, we have in the results indicate at least that there are other benefits for both individuals and society. So this is also something that we want to follow up more closely. One of those things, for instance, is the fact that these students can actually work at the same time as they're going through HVE Flex, which, for instance, means that they don't need student financing. And then that, of course, will both be an important gain for both them and for society as a whole. We are also talking about whether this is reaching a new target group. We're not sure. Our providers tell us so. And one of the things that indicates that they do reach a different target group than normally is the fact that the students enrolled in EU Flex is about 10 years older than that of students going through the normal route in programs for HV. So the average of the HV Flex students is about 40 years old, where the average age for students going through HV in Sweden is 30. And just looking at the age profile of these students means that they have a lot of experience with them. So we do think that that is an important part why we should really work with exemptions, because someone that is 30, 35 coming back into the education system will definitely have a lot of experience and skills that can be validated with them. So this is an important part. And finally, I just wanted to show you a slide of what's been said and talked about this pilot here in Sweden. Many stakeholders and labor market actors in specific, so both employer and employee associations and etc., are looking at this as an important addition to the vocational education landscape in Sweden. And they foresee that the interest in this will increase over the coming years. And also a lot of the education providers taking part in this pilot, they say the same. And we interviewed one of the students in the summer last year. She was working as an assistant nurse, caring for elderly people, and had done so for many years. And then she wanted to upskill, let's say, to be able to do the same work, but with the maybe more advanced tasks in her workplace. So she enrolled in EOFlex. She did her 2-year programs in a period of 6 months instead of the 2 years. And she was very, very proud also to say that this gave her a good opportunity to change jobs and have more responsibility and also a better salary at her job when she's done. And she ended her interview with saying that she recommends this to all her co-workers because she thinks it's a good way for them to get recognition for the skills they have developed in the professional lives. So this is one example of a student that has been going through this system and who is apparently very happy doing so. With that, I'm going to stop.
Anna, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's a very groundbreaking result, and it's very reassuring to finally have the data which proves the point that we have been making already for a while, that the right funding model for validation can ultimately make the training programs cheaper and make the upskilling also faster. We hope that our partners will be able to bring this example up to their ministries of finance and financing departments. And with that, we would like to move to the next presentation. Foundation VCC in Poland is among the front runners and most active bodies among non-state providers of validation in Poland. So I have the pleasure to welcome Edyta Migałka and Marek Marczak. Welcome and dzień dobry, to hear and to show us the perspective of provider.
Thank you for having us. We are really grateful, and thank you to all the speakers for the utmost interesting presentations. And what we are going to do now, we are going to show you the provider's perspective of non-formal qualifications in Poland. And Edyta is going to start the presentation, and I'm going to take over in a moment.
Hello, everyone. We would like to also express our support with our neighbors from Ukraine. I will give you a short background about our national qualification system, and Marek will say a few words about our experience as a provider in validation and qualification processes. So our integrated qualification system is developed in Poland from 2016, and it is, of course, the answer for the Council recommendation of validation. The main goals of the system was to integrate of different qualifications confirmed in Poland, recognize of learning outcomes obtained in different ways, supervision of the quality of qualifications, and a possibility of to compare qualifications on the European market. In the structure of the system, we have 3 areas. Qualifications that are divided into partial and full. In the partial, we have regulated as driving license, for example, and market qualifications. Then we have processes such as description of qualifications, validation, quality assurance, and accumulation of achievements. And then the third area is the institution. And here we have bodies which are responsible for quality, certification and validation bodies, ministries responsible for the qualifications, and stakeholder council, which is advice body for minister coordinator of integrated qualification system. The minister coordinator is in Poland, Minister of Education and Science. The system is based on Polish qualifications framework. It is corresponds one-to-one with European qualifications framework. As you see, it has 8 levels from elementary school to doctorate, and vocational education is crossing all the levels. As you can see, qualifications which are proposed by VCC Foundation are from the level 2 to 7. And a few words about the market qualifications, because I think it's our specific in Poland. It's a new type of qualification. It's always developed bottom up by industry, vet organization, foundations, employers. They also always become public property at the moment of application, but we must sell it as on the market rights. So it's quite unusual, I think. It can be contacted only by the certified institutions, but one qualifications, market qualification, can have few institutions which are validating it or certified. The short presentation about the process of implementing market qualifications. First of all, it's a submission of application, for example, prepared by VCC Foundation or other institution. After a formal assessment, the application is transferred to the responsible minister. Then they are consultation with the sector, with the industry, or anyone who wants to give some remarks of the application. And ministry also obtain opinion from 2 experts from the sector, from the area of qualification, and then is a decision. It can be positive or negative, depends on the consultation process. After a positive assessment, there is an assignment of the Polish qualification framework level and the legislation process. It's a preparation of and publication of a notice of inclusion, that qualification in the system. So that's the path. The process usually takes about 12 months in Poland. So now I will give voice to Marek, and he will tell something about our experience. Thank you for hearing.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our path to award the qualifications in the integrated qualification system. So the first thing is that we have been creating the certification system actually since 2007. And outside this qualification system, we have more than 100 qualifications which we have developed, and we have issued 100,000 certificates. Now, the first qualification, market qualification that was included in the integrated qualification system was construction joinery fitting. And this qualification was about fitting doors, windows, both external and internal, gates, grills. And this qualification was developed on this bottom-up approach. So what we have is the representatives of employers, of producers, and trade organizations. They came to us saying, we get a lot of complaints because doors, windows were fitted not properly. So we need a qualification that we need to create in order to reduce the number of complaints we are getting. And this is actually how it happened. This qualification was planned, was created, and it was the first qualification to join the integrated qualification system in 2016. Now, we have submitted more than 30 applications to include our qualifications to the system. And currently we are authorized to certify 19 market qualifications, being, I think, the largest entity in that area. Now, on behalf of the Educational Institute in Poland, we also developed validation tools for system qualification, such as validation advisor, assessor, validation designer, and coordinator to actually train people how to design the whole process, how to assess, just to make sure that simply the standard of the qualifications offered is higher. Now, just a few examples of qualifications that are awarded by the VIS Foundation. These are the ones included in the integrated qualification system. Now, our qualifications cover a very, very broad area. So it includes IT qualifications, it includes hospitality sectors. As you can see, we have dishes preparation, we have also 3D printing process. Now, actually behind us, you can see a 3D printer that we actually provide to simply entities that we validate and assess. So it's quite a broad list. Now, how we actually do it? Well, essentially, we have exams that are divided into two parts. The first one is a theoretical exam, which almost always takes place on our e-learning online platform. So it's always included in our validation scenario. And so the actually knowledge effects are verified in this way. And we also have a practical exam. So that's could be, observation, simulated conditions, there could be interviews with the exam board. So it depends really on the specificity of given qualifications. And the rule is that there need to be at least 2 assessors that will conduct this validation process during the practical part. Now, that is important in order to make sure that this process is as objective as possible, and validation time is pretty lengthy. As you can see, it can take from 3 to 8 hours, depending on the qualification. And that happens because all the learning outcomes have to be verified during the assessment process. So sometimes when a qualification has a lot of learning outcomes and effects that we need to validate, this process is quite lengthy. Now I'm going to play you a promotional video that actually shows the process of construction joinery fitting, basically how we do it, to give you some idea as to how it actually happens. Oh, sorry. I hope you can see it. Okay. So coming back to the presentation, right? So what you were able to see was the actual process, how the whole validation process happens, both in the theoretical and the practical part. Now, an important thing is that we, as a provider of this qualification, we provide everything that is needed, and we have something called mobile laboratories that simply travel, across Poland to a place where the validation is supposed to take place. Now, as you can see here, we issue certificates confirming qualifications. And in the left top corner, you can see that we have a mark of National Qualifications Framework. So, and the certificate is issued in English. So when a person who obtains such a certificate, which also comes with a supplement, by the way, simply wants to start employment abroad, then the employer, for instance, can see which level of qualification that is, and that can be easily mapped onto the European qualifications framework. Okay, now, what are the assumptions for validation, both for staff and organizational conditions? Well, first of all, we have assessors that we accredit, and they must be practitioners and people who actively work in a given sector. And also these people help us to create qualification, also design various validation tools. So we just make sure that they are competent and they can conduct the process properly. And as has been said, the board always consists of 2 assessors. Now, as I already mentioned, the certifying institution like ours, we provide all the equipment for validation. So we have our validation stations, as you were able to see in the video. It simply comes in pieces and it's put together wherever the validation is about to take place. They are totally mobile, and as far as I know, it's pretty unique on the market, at least in Poland. And also part of the validation can be carried out online. It was approved by the ministry due to COVID-19 pandemic. So we have also conducted remote validations, which was, well, it was pretty challenging, well, for various reasons. One of them being that we always need to monitor the participants. So when we share a screen with you, like it's one-to-many, it's no problem, but the problem starts when many people will need to share whatever they are doing with you. So just to give you an example of potential challenges that we are facing. Now, about the quality assurance of the process. Well, first of all, we have internal quality assurance, and we have our procedures. We have ISOs that we have implemented and that we are audited on. We have ISO 9001 to 7001, and we also have GDPR procedures in place. But each market qualification has entity that assures external quality. Now, such an entity can always take part in the validation process and see how it goes, and also writes a report. So in that way, also that there's an external entity that that makes sure that everything goes according to the standards. Now, the current state of implementation of integrated qualification system, 122 market qualifications, but they currently functioning are 74. The others are still pending due to various reasons, have not been launched yet. There are 59 institutions that can grant market qualifications. And totally 2,544 certificates of market qualifications were issued by the end of 2021, out of which almost 2,000 certificates were issued by our organization. Now, a business case for validation. Well, there are several challenges. Challenges are both the low awareness and the low awareness of the integrated qualification system. There's quite a lot of work to be done with still governments and other organizations just to make this system recognizable. Challenges can happen on like, you know, different organizational issues. In order to register and create this qualification and also to conduct it, you need to have quite substantive material conditions to be able to do it, and also to have the know-how as how to do it. And it seems to be quite a big barrier. And also lack of state funding. Well, there's no systemic state funding. But on the other hand, when we talk about opportunities, we have EU funds. So most of the programs that we are doing are subsidized by European Union funds. So actually for the participants, it's free. Now, another opportunity is the possibility of creating remote validations. And I'm going to show you an example of qualification that we are actually trying to put onto VR. We use those goggles. I'm not be able to put them on right now, but here they are. With these goggles, we actually have developed a VR software that we are going to put to test. We are going to see if actually the process of 3D printing, like with the tools that you can see behind me, a 3D printer can be done in virtual reality. Now, the last but not least, the qualification that come on the integrated qualification system can be also included in school curricula. So school principals can include these qualifications as part of the school curricula, and they are also can be offered free of charge for students of secondary schools. Okay, so that's basically all that we wanted to say. Thank you very much for your patience, and if you should have any questions, we will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interesting presentation. I think it shows the story of non-formal qualifications. So a number of our partner countries actually opened or are planning to open their qualification frameworks to non-formal qualifications. And for me, it is actually very interesting to see that the qualifications which non-state actors propose interact also with the formal education system when schools consider including them in the curricula. But also I think it is very interesting to note that non-state actors can bring a lot of innovation to the system. The example of a mobile laboratory for assessment, the exploration of remote validation opportunities. I think it does show that there can be some more agile actors also looking for business opportunities. We have a question from Rodion from Ukraine to Marek. It's a question about tools that VCC Foundation developed for, I understand that this is a question about these qualifications for validation practitioners, whether the process has been paid.
Could you repeat your question? Like what kind of tools you have in mind?
Yes, Rodion, if I understood correctly your question, you are asking whether the qualifications for validation practitioners, which the VCC Foundation has developed, whether this has been somehow contracted by this day. Is that the right understanding, Rodion?
Yes, absolutely correct.
Yeah, well, it actually it was commissioned by the EBA, right? That is the Educational Research Institute. Sorry, well, simply we are creating it for them, right? So we are developing guidelines, we are developing programs, we'll be doing the testing process. It's currently in progress, so it's not done yet.
But the funds are from EU funds for the project. Yeah, it's a project of Educational Research Institute, and it's EU funding for this.
So anyway, this work is paid, and no matter what source of this payment. So this is the delegated functions from the authorized institution, yes, which is delegated to you, and you are doing this. And but can, for example, other stakeholders or institutions use your tools? Is it after approval? Is it public property, or is it your property? So how it is organized in Poland and in your institution specifically? Thank you.
It was a competition, so it
was a tender, right?
It was a tender, so we had to won this project, and there are qualifications, system qualifications, and they will be tested. We don't know what will be the future. It's a public property. We have to give all the rights to the schools, to research Educational Research Institute. So it's their property, and they in the future, I think, they will be develop this tools and confirmed the qualification for the sector. Because now, if you want to be an assessor, for example, of integrated qualification system, you don't have to have any qualifications or specific for assessors. So you have should have competences, experience in the area, but
so
not
also training experience is very important.
Also training experience, but not the specific qualifications for assessors or validation advisor, etc. So it will be developed, but we don't know. Maybe there will be another path for this qualification. Then they will not be certified by a commercial institution, but maybe by a public one, like Educational Research Institute.
Mm-hmm. Just to complement what Edyta said, now an important thing with the integrated qualification system is that, well, during the registration process, there are some fees that you have to pay, and once the qualification has been registered, you transfer all the rights to for the qualification to the state. And essentially this is how it works. So it's no longer your qualification, and what is more, once the qualification has been registered, other institutions, other certifying institutions can simply join in order to certify, to offer this qualification. So you don't have rights for it, and other institutions can use it as well, as long as they meet conditions that are specified.
Thank you very much. Thank you for answering the questions and presenting your case and joining us. I think we are simply moving into the topic of innovation. Our next agenda point is an interview with Simon Schmidt from Skill Lab startup. Hello, Simon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Skill Lab is a startup, Amsterdam-based startup, which developed a mobile application tool, which uses artificial intelligence to help people explore, capture, and document, present their skills. The tool has been successfully put in use already in collaboration with a number of actors, with International Labour Organization, but also with employment agencies. We will not be talking about validation in a strict sense, but about tool which looks at skills profiling. Simon, once again, thank you for joining us. And my first question, could you please share with our audience the purpose of the tool, how it can be used, and benefit from it?
Great, yeah, thank you. First of all, Maria, thank you for having us. Thank you to the ETF for having us. I'm responsible for the public sector at Skill Lab. Skill Lab is a social business, we're an impact business. And what we do is we provide digital solutions that allow people to really access career guidance that is focused on their skills. We aim to help people make what's usually invisible, their skills, their experiences, etc., visible to the labor market, to enable people to find pathways to employment and ultimately turn their skills into a sustainable, resilient, satisfying career. We generally work with public and private employment services, NGOs, and education providers, and partners use our solution really to amend and to add to what they already provide in terms of career guidance. So the core solution we provide is the Skill Lab mobile application. It's a remotely delivered digital mobile application that you can also use on your desktop or however you choose to use it. And it basically enables users to create a skill profile from over 13,500 skills based on the European skills qualifications, occupations taxonomy, ESCO. And basically through the creation of their skill profile, users document and recognize their experiences and their prior learning and the skills they have gained through their different experiences. Our use of AI here is really meant to help guide users through the skill profile creation. So our artificial intelligence organizes these 13,500 ESCO skills to interview the user. So our goal within the interview is to capture as many of the relevant skills, so as many of the skills of the user as possible, in as few questions as possible. So then once users have created their skill profile, which really for us is this, what you just mentioned, Maria, the informal step in recognizing prior learning. Based on this recognized prior learning, users can explore different careers, occupations, and vacancies that might be a good fit from a skill perspective. And if they find a career that they're interested in and they're not yet a good fit, we recommend learning experiences, courses, education, VET, etc., that directly address the gap between the user skills and the requirements of that occupation or vacancy. Finally, in the final step, users can use their created skill profile to generate application materials such as a CV and a resume and apply to vacancies that are integrated in the application. At the same time, how our partners use Skill Lab, and that's basically using all of the information that the user's input is accessible to our partners. So that includes features like tracking progress to the application, searching for occupation and skill matches, and doing a lot of data analysis and labor market information things on the back end. For example, figuring out what is a skill gap within the entire population, how do the people I serve match in-demand occupations, etc. So the way we currently work, we currently have ongoing projects in over 30 countries. We're available in 27 different languages. That includes all EU languages, plus Icelandic, Norwegian, and Arabic. And we work with public employment services. For example, we work with public employment services to specifically target individuals that are not in employment, education, or training. We work with NGOs specifically aimed at young unemployed people. We work with training providers to really guide people to the right courses and learning experiences to build towards their career goals. And through these projects, really, the feedback that we've gotten from our partners is that Skill Lab helps them better understand and service their beneficiaries and clients specifically around the ability for people to describe their own skills and express them in a structured way, which in our experience is really crucial to go through the first 2 steps of the RPL process, where it's really identifying and documenting prior learning before getting to validation and using that documented prior learning to provide better career guidance.
So Simon, thank you for this introduction. In practical terms, I understand that the application, once people open it, asks them questions, and here comes the power of artificial intelligence that several answers have been provided. There are certain channels to reach the directions in which the further questions are asked. And interesting is that your application is very good at identifying the skills of persons who might not even consider that by doing what they have been doing in the past, for example, they were not professionally active, but they were stay-home parents. The tool is also able to grasp skills that they developed staying at home with kids, for example.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we really kind of try to broaden the scope of what we think about as a professional experience and as an experience that's worth capturing. Currently, and I checked for the last time last week, currently around 25% of all the skills that people have entered into SkillUp come from informal experiences. And informal experiences includes everything from raising children to taking care of your elderly parents to coaching a football team. So all of these things that are usually not captured on the CV, but that are really crucial and in many cases provide skills that are really almost more valuable than skills that may have been acquired through education or through formal education or through formal employment. So we think it's really important to look at people's resumes and people's experiences and people's skills in a holistic way, and include all of the experiences that go beyond what's typically on a LinkedIn profile or in a CV.
I can imagine that it can be quite an empowering experience for people to actually realize how many skills they have of which they have not been even aware earlier. So we mentioned about the results that the tool is able to return a visual representation of person's skills. And when we think about potential further steps and link to validation systems, I can imagine that in the future, such tool could also link the candidate directly to complementary training. For example, it could say you have 60% of a qualification of teacher's assistant or early education assistant. Here is the college where you could complement this skill. Have you already tested this kind of linking to further education courses?
Yes, we already link to further education and to courses. However, the thing that we're missing a little bit is that validation component and the license and the, like, let's call it formal requirements component, just because we currently work in over 30 different countries. All of these countries have different requirements when it comes to qualification. For example, we work in Italy, where vocational qualifications are different from the state to state within the country. So it makes it incredibly complicated to capture all of the qualification requirements. So right now what we're doing is we look at a person's skills as they are right now, so their current skill profile, and we map education that can help them fill the skill gap. So for example, if they're looking at the job of a construction manager, for example, and they have around 50% of the skills which might be a good match but might not be good enough for them to work in that occupation, we would then, on the page where they're looking at that occupation, we would then show them courses that would add to their current skills with the needed skills, with the skills that are still missing, the skill gap to be a better match for that occupation. That is unfortunately, as of now, sort of disconnected from validation and disconnected from the formal qualifications and formal, let's call them licensing steps. But we aim to get there. It's just a question of we would have to invest resources in that very specific area where those specific qualifications are necessary.
The possibilities are theoretically there. I understand what is the key is the very transparent and granular information on the course content and also expression. I am wondering whether the works on qualification frameworks and databases and registers, this is a line of work in which ETF is also engaging very strongly, and we are planning to work on it further with our partner countries, whether availability of such databases, rich with information on learning outcomes, could actually support further use of tools like the one you developed. And coming further maybe to the topic of user experience, we in our work we highlight a lot that the candidate has to be in the center, and that the services which we offer to our candidates have to really consider the unique profiles of our candidates. Could you tell us how a startup approaches the user experience in practical terms? How did you work on your tool?
So yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the answer goes a little bit back to how SkillLab started. And we really started, the idea started during the European migrant crisis in 2016, where a lot of really qualified people came into Europe from Syria and from other countries in the Middle East, and couldn't really couldn't find their way on the labor market despite their experiences. And when we asked ourselves that question, why, for us it was, the core reason was that their titles and everything that's on the CV and formal experiences did not translate, and that the more granular skills that might translate were not visible. So we built SkillLab specifically with that migrant refugee user group in mind, and that's usually a group where you might experience lower digital literacy, you might experience people that don't speak the language that particularly well. So we really had to design the product with users in mind. Ultimately, even with the smallest amount throughout this process, we did workshops, we did feedback sessions, we hired people from the community we serve, and all to that end to truly understand the needs of the population we wanted to serve. So while the company, while SkillLab has evolved to serve a wider population, that core around designing for usability and designing with the user in mind has not changed. So for us, if users, and users in our case means both job seekers, but also means the career guidance counselors and the people supporting the job seekers, if those people do not use the application, we can have the most elegant algorithm, we can have the best AI engine, we can have the best content, best data analysis, but without people actually using the application, it's not worth anything. So ultimately for us, designing a product that's user-centered and human-centered means learning from testing with target users, understanding the needs of target users, and everything we've developed thus far has started with a research phase that heavily incorporates people that ultimately will use the application, and ends in an A/B testing phase. So we test everything with different groups of beneficiaries to make sure that everything we develop actually is beneficial and actually makes sense for the audience, for the users that we target.
I think it's a very important point and very insightful for also for us for the work on developing the validation systems. And thank you very much for that. We do not have enough time to share some more visual materials to showcase the SkillLab work, but perhaps, Simon, you could just type in the chat the link to the website, and if there is a link to the video that demonstrates how does the interface look like. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing with us how the future will look like. I always feel that when working on our public sector systems, we really need to consider what is happening outside and how we can link the systems to those future developments in order not to stay obsolete. Yes, so thank you once again. I do not see any questions from the audience. Okay, I think in this case we can slowly start concluding our event. But before I will hand over to Arjen for closing remarks, we have a request to you to participate in a short poll. So I will ask our technicians now to put on the screen the address of Mentimeter. That would be the next question. Yes, we would like to ask you about your #1 takeaway from the webinar. So after listening to the challenges and learning learning about some innovative practices, what will be your number one, and only one answer is possible, priority for your further work on validation? If you could go to the Menti website and use the code that is in the top of the screen, you will be able to access the poll, or just click on the website that's shared in the chat. Okay, we have slowly participants joining the voting. We will wait a little bit longer, perhaps more participants will join. There are still many of you, I see, following us, over 100 participants, and the answers start coming as well. So far, I see a very even distribution of priorities. The right business model will be on the agenda, further development of the regulations, assessing demand, mobilizing funding. We see that our messages have reached you, building capacities, staff, innovative assessment methods. We see more on mobilizing funding. Well, this is a very interesting result for us because it just shows that there is a need to work on many, many different topics in the future. Okay, I think we can close the poll. Thank you very much. Oh, there are still some more questions coming. But nevertheless, it's a very even distribution of answers. Okay, thank you very much. And now I, from myself, would like to thank you for being with us, to all the presenters for sharing their practices, and to you, dear partners. And I will hand over to Arjen for final remarks.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you for all the preparations for this event, which have been very rich. As you can see, validation is really starting to be more and more prominent in more and more partner countries, and it's not an area that is already settled. It's very much dynamic. There are a lot of new developments, and I think that's really important. So can we actually, the countries that are starting now, can they maybe learn from these experiences from the other countries? It's very interesting how they are moving forward, that there is a strong focus on individuals, that there is an importance of this idea of the business case, so to create sustainable solutions, that it must be attractive for people, that it also uses new type of applications. We looked at new ways of funding, new ways of assessing and using technologies. All of this was in these examples. As you can see, it is very much developing. And our question actually is, how important are these things also for you? Because we see now in the end that there are a lot of issues that are coming out as being really important for everybody. But what we want to focus on is also how we're going to move forward with this topic, because this is one of our priority topics for the period until 2027, together with also recognition, together with also the digitalization and internationalization of qualification systems. We really see these things as very important. We have, of course, shared with you the background paper, also the fact sheets of the countries, but we also going to share with you the cross-country report that will soon be available. And of course, all the documentation, all the presentations that you saw here, also the video, they will all be available for viewing afterwards. We are also preparing a brochure on funding, because funding is really a crucial issue, as we've seen. So these are our plans for this year, we're also going to work on the inventory of the countries that are in the Western Balkans and Turkey, and also some additional countries, so that we have more and a better understanding over where these systems are going. My question to you, actually, as participants, since we are still with 116 participants in this room, is to ask, how do you see the importance of this peer learning from each other, exchanging experiences? There was a whole conference in the chat next to the conference that was on the screen, so I really appreciate that. I think there should be more interaction between us. So what I really would like to ask you is, could you actually use your thumbs up if you want us to work towards a more organized network of validation practitioners and people who are involved in establishing the systems? So if you just go to the raise your hand, we can see then I really would like to say, well, then we need to come back to you with some proposal, how we're going to manage that. Of course, we're going to use open space probably, but we need also to see how we can have more exchanges and more targeted exchanges and more discussion with you on these topics, because this is really, really important to get things going. Thank you very much for attending. Thank the interpreters, because this was really a challenge with so many languages that we have shared. So I hope it has been very useful for everybody. I found it very useful. And I would have liked actually to hear more about also the difficulties that countries have in starting and how we can overcome them. So may I thank all of you for your participation, and I hope to see you soon. Stay safe, especially for the Ukrainian colleagues. Be careful. We really, you're really essential in all of this. We stand with you. We are supporting you, and we hope that this war will finish, and that we can help also Ukraine further with the reconstruction, in which, of course, validation will play a very important role. Thank you all for participating, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Nani. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot to everybody. I will now close the session, and we will hear from each other soon.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for your hard work and all this. Everything went very smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.